Okay, so once again, welcome everyone to week 4, being the judges and the kings of Israel. So we'll quickly go through a summary of what we've covered to date. So Steve took us through in week 1 that God is eternal, always has been, always will be, and that's kind of hard to get our heads around, isn't it? And he is in fact one entity. He is a God of goodness and severity. The two can coexist absolutely. So he's a loving God. We know that he's loving by the amount of mercy that he showed throughout the Bible and forgiveness and the grace that he's offered all of us. But he also can be severe in regards to keeping his law. God wants the world to be filled with his glory. I mean, this is the meaning of life. This is the purpose. This is why we're here. And in the timeline, we see Habakkuk 2:14, as truly as all the earth will be filled with the glory of the... as truly as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. So that is the purpose. That's why we're here, to give our Creator that glory. Steve took us through creation, literal 6 days of creation, and the 7th day God rested, and introduced us to Adam and Eve and the sin that happened in that garden. And then we're introduced to the salvation that was offered in Genesis 3:15, and that enmity between sin nature and the seed of the woman being Christ. Abraham, so the following week, Rob took us through Abraham, started with his name Abram, and took us through the promises that were made. Some pretty significant promises. Last week, Simon summarised that, so I don't plan to go through those again. But some of those promises in detail, some of those promises were around the land, were around the nation of Israel being many, or his descendants being many, was that all the families of the earth will be blessed. And so we had linkages in the New Testament with Galatians 3:16, identifying how that was going to be possible. How would all the families of the earth be blessed? And that was through the seed. And Galatians 3:16 told us the seed which is one, which is Christ Jesus. So identified who that seed was. And then we looked at how Abraham didn't receive the promises, and he needs to be resurrected to receive those. And we found that in Hebrews 11. So this is the timeline for the first 2,000 years that we covered, and we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? We've got the fall in Habakkuk 2:14, we've got creation, Adam, Cain and Abel, the first children born to Adam and Eve, Seth and Noah to the flood, so huge amount of a span of period of time, and the Tower of Babel. Last week, Simon introduced us to Jacob, who had his name changed to Israel, and the 12 tribes that came from Israel, why they're called the children of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. We looked at the story of Joseph, how he was slaved into Egypt. He was sold into Egypt as a slave, and that it's through God's guiding hand that he experienced some hardships. But he came out of that hardship as the second ruler in the land and actually delivered the then known world from a severe drought that lasted 7 years. And it's in that drought that Isaac and his family came down and occupied the land of Egypt. Now Pharaoh was so pleased with Joseph that he gave that family the best land in Egypt to occupy, the land of Goshen. And they really multiplied over the 400 years that they were there to be in the number of millions population. So obviously that Pharaoh died, another Pharaoh came on the scene, and they were put into slavery because the children of Israel were a threat basically to the Egyptians. And so we pick up that story where the people were obviously in slavery, they were under hardship, and they cried out to God, and God sent a saviour in the form of Moses. So Moses had three major parts of his life, all three being 40 years. So 40 years in Pharaoh's court, 40 years as a shepherd in the wilderness, until the fiery bush where God sent him back into Egypt to deliver his people. And then 40 years delivering the people through the wilderness, getting them to the land of promise. And Simon took us through how God did that with the 10 plagues, and we touched briefly on the last plague being the Passover, where there was a very strong type that led to Jesus Christ around how they were going to be saved from that Passover angel. They then left Egypt after those 10 plagues and went through the Red Sea through a real baptism. And the New Testament identified crossing the Red Sea as a baptism because they had water either side and they had the cloud overhead that was guiding them, and they went from their old life into their new life, almost like a probation in the wilderness to get them to the promised land. And there's some strong linkages there to what we go through today through the waters of baptism and starting our probation towards the kingdom. So some really strong types and golden threads all throughout the Bible, and we keep picking these golden threads up. So they spent a year at Sinai, Mount Sinai, and they got the Ten Commandments and the Law of Moses. And the Law of Moses was really there to help the people remain faithful. So it gave them really clear instructions of how to be separate from the other nations and how to live righteous lives until they got to the New Testament. Thank you for that. So they then, after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, they got to the promised land, and Joshua and Caleb led them across the River Jordan into the promised land. And God instructed them to wipe out the inhabitants that were there because they were extremely evil. And when we say evil, child sacrifice and a lot of evil behaviour. So God wanted a clean slate and for the children of Israel to occupy the promised land. That was then the land of Canaan, then became the land of Israel. So that was last week. So we've covered a lot of ground there already. And that brings us up to where we're at with our timeline, where we had the brazen serpent that Simon talked to. That was a type of Christ in regards to they had to look up at the brazen serpent to be saved from the snakes that they were under attack from. And that's obviously a clear linkage to Jesus the seed. So what are we going to cover off today? We're going to be looking at who are the judges. Who were they? Why were they needed? How long were they there for? We'll look at the first king of Israel being Saul. And he started off pretty well. He started off quite humble, but then had some failings later on. We'll look at King David, king of Israel, and we'll look at his life really briefly and the promises and the covenant that God made with David. We'll look at Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a very special place in God's eyes. It was prophesied that Jerusalem would be selected to be the nation's capital, but there's also some future prophecies as well about how Jerusalem will play into the future kingdom on earth. We'll look at David's son Solomon. Now, I think everyone's heard of Solomon, Solomon's Mines. It's been the centre of a lot of movies, but we'll look at his reign and see if there's any learnings there for us as well. After Solomon, the kingdom was divided. How on earth was the 12 tribes divided? What circumstances led to that? We'll unpack that as we go through the session this afternoon. It was separated into the 10 northern tribes, being Israel, and the 2 southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the southern area. And we'll look at some of the prophets of Israel. So a lot of the Old Testament, especially the back portion of the Old Testament, has a lot of that is prophets that God sent to both the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah to try and correct them, to get them back on track. And often they were not met very nicely and they were ignored because they didn't like the messages that they were carrying. So we'll have a look at the prophets of Israel as well. We'll then go into detail about the kingdom of Judah and have a look at some of its history as well. And that's where we'll finish up this afternoon. So setting the scene, if we remember from last week, they got to the end of their wilderness wanderings. They're on the brink of the Jordan River, and they crossed the Jordan River with the ark ahead of them, Ark of the Covenant, led by the priests, and they entered the Promised Land. And like I said, God instructed them to wipe the area clean of its inhabitants because they were extremely evil. And they did that for the most part, but they didn't follow that entirely. So they did leave remnants of these nations throughout the whole land of Israel. You can see there on the screen the different tribal areas or the allotments that God had allocated to the 12 tribes. So not sure why Manasseh got such a big portion there, but east and west of Manasseh, you see Judah down the bottom there with Benjamin, and Jerusalem in Judah, down at the top bit of Judah there. So setting the scene, that they now occupy the promised land. This is the land that Abraham was standing on when God gave him the promises that look northward, southward, eastward and westward. Everything you see, I'll give to you and your seed forever. So this is the very land that was promised them, and they're finally here. They're finally settled in the land of promise. Really exciting. However, Joshua, who was an amazing leader, eventually gets old and dies. He's off the scene. And the children of Israel really are left to their own devices for the most part. And so we go through this cyclical 4 S's of, it's a primary theme that we see during this period. So they first sin, and from the sin becomes suffering. So often God uses other nations to correct their sin and as judgment, and so they suffer from these nations. And at the very bottom of the curve, they seek God. They pray to God for assistance to help them. And then they come back out the other side as salvation. And the salvation that God offers is the judges. So this is the period of the judges. The judges lasted for about 350 years. And it just goes this cyclical. As soon as the judge dies, they then sin. They suffer as a result of that sin. They seek God. And then God offers salvation through a judge. So time and time and time again. And it's easy to sit here in our day and go, how silly were they? How could they be so weak? But we follow the same cyclical period in our lives, don't we? At times where, we sin and we suffer from that sin at times, and then we need to seek God, and that's the amazing hope that we have in Jesus Christ, is we have that salvation on offer. So who can name some of the judges? Any major ones come to mind? And maybe an example of an exploit that that judge did. Gideon. What's big in Gideon's life as a judge? Overthrew the Midianites? Yeah, that's right. Yep. Samson? Yeah, my boys love Samson as a character. Classic story. Big strong man. Relatively, he had his weaknesses, didn't he? But God used those weaknesses to bring about his will and his judgment on the Philistines and to deliver the children of Israel from the Philistines. Any other judges that come to mind? Samuel? Yeah, he was the last judge. Yeah, he was an awesome, faithful judge that really led the people well, and we'll look at Samuel in a bit of detail. Any others? Sorry? Deborah, yes. There was women judges as well, and she was a great example of leading the people out of suffering. Sorry? Nice. Cool. Yeah, so there's a couple up there. Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson and Samuel. So they're the references and they're the years of peace that were experienced under the judges' rule. So this is just some graphic, just showing graphically where the nations came and attacked and which judge rescued them. So Othniel defeats the Mesopotamians, Ehud defeats Elog, king of the Moabites, Shamgar defeats the Philistines, Deborah and Barak defeat King Jabin. We've got Gideon drives out the Midianites and Amalekites, Jephthah defeats the Amorites, and Samson exploits the Philistines. So once again, all these nations that they really should have cleared out when they first came into the land, they didn't fully follow God's instruction there, and they suffered for that. And they mainly suffered because of the sin, because they were, as this verse says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So that verse really sums up this period. So looking at the last great judge, we talked about earlier, Samuel. So he lived from 1100 to 970 BC. Sometimes a bit confusing because we're counting down. We're used to counting up in time, but we're counting down to 0 AD, obviously Jesus. Samuel's faithfulness is attested in Hebrews, and I quote, "What more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Samuel, who through faith administered justice and gained what was promised." So that's Hebrews 11, the faith chapter, talking about Samuel there. So yes, Samuel was an amazing judge and really faithful. So here we put the period of the judges up, the 350 years, up on the timeline. We're just on the cusp of the millennial change, getting to 1000 BC. So we're going to briefly cover off the kings over the 12 tribes. So we're at the end of the judges, and we'll get into in a bit more detail around how this transition happened. Why did we go from judges to kings? What were the people after there? So to cover off the kings of Israel really quickly, the ones we're going to cover off today at least, We're going to Saul, David, Solomon, and there's the years that they were up on the screen. And then the kingdom divided in 931. Like I said, we'll unpack that in a bit more detail. So Saul, Israel's first king. Who can tell us anything about Saul? Any memorable moments about King Saul? Yes?
Like when David, like he was chasing David around the mountains and then and he almost caught up to David because David's men were just on foot and he had chariots and horses and
Yep.
yeah,
that's right.
And
yep.
then he got a message from his king saying, we're being attacked. And I think that was God sending somebody to attack him to David.
Yeah, save David out of Saul's hand. That's right. So Saul was very jealous of David, and we'll get into that in a bit. That's really good, Lucas. Thank you. Any other attributes of Saul?
I was just going to say, he was head and shoulders above the rest.
Yeah, that's right. No, but he was. So the people, they wanted a leader that they could follow, that would lead them into battle. And Saul was that. The Bible tells us he was handsome and he was head and shoulders above the rest. He was big, tall, and could lead them into battle. Any other attributes? Yeah, that's right. He had a pretty good beginning, right? Like he didn't want to be king. He actually hid when they were trying to anoint him king. Over time, his weak faith came into play. So how did this all transpire? So basically, the people wanted to be like the nations around them. They saw that into battle, they had their strong kings, and the elders came to Samuel and asked for a king. Samuel was really sad about this. He really thought they were rejecting him as the judge. And God speaks to him in 1 Samuel 8, verses 6 to 7. And I quote, "But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, 'Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them.'" A bit of a summary on that. So God allowed this to happen. God was like, we're going to listen. And they haven't rejected you. They've actually rejected me, because God was the king of Israel. It was God's kingdom on earth at that time. And often we think of God's kingdom on earth as something in the future, but it was present on this earth during this time while God was their king. So that sets the scene around how Saul came to the scene. And so we've covered off some of the attributes of Saul, where he started off relatively humble, but then his weak nature came into play. He had two major events of disobedience, of weakness that came through in his life. The first one, the Philistines were attacking, the army was approaching. Samuel said, "Wait till I get there and I'll offer the sacrifice." And he saw the army coming and he had a lack of faith and he offered the sacrifice without Samuel present. And just as he's finishing up, Samuel comes around the corner, "What have you done?" And so at that point, the result of that sin was God told Samuel to tell Saul that basically his line will no longer be a king's line. Basically, Jonathan, his son, would not inherit the throne. The second major disobedience was God said, "Destroy the Amalekites," everything. Even the animals, absolutely destroy them. They're very wicked. I want them wiped off the earth. And Saul disobeyed. He took it into his own hands to save the best of the flock. He even didn't kill the king. And Samuel said, "To obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the bleat of lambs." So there's that classic verses in verse 22 and verse 23 there. So at this point, the consequence of this sin was God said, "I am actually rejecting you, and I am stepping away from you altogether." And this was the last time Samuel actually saw Saul until he died. And so Saul is completely abandoned by his mentor, which has been up to this point Samuel, and the presence of God. And often Saul tried to inquire of God to get some direction when the Philistines attacked. Complete silence. God had stepped away from him. So it's at this point that God told Samuel to go anoint a new king. And so we're introduced to David. So God told Samuel to go to the house of Jesse, who was Bethlehem. And Jesse was obviously the tribe of Judah. And we're told, if we go back to the blessings that Isaac gave to Judah back a couple of weeks ago, where that there was the line of Judah, there would be kings. So there was some language used in there around the scepter shall not depart, and a lawgiver between thy feet. that was pointing forwards to that the tribe of Judah was in fact a kingly line, and we know that Jesus was the tribe of Judah as well, which we'll get at shortly. So David was the tribe of Judah, and so Solomon went there and eventually went through all Jesse's sons, and Samuel thought Saul, big strong one once again, and thought surely this is the Lord's anointed, and God said, no, I look in the heart of the man. He's not the king. And eventually they got to the youngest son, which was David, who was a shepherd out tending the Jesse's flocks, and God selected David because of what was on the inside of the heart, which is very different to Saul, which was an outward appearance. So we know that he was chosen as king. He was called a man after God's own heart. And that's really telling in regards to how God viewed David. Once again, very humble beginning. As a shepherd, would have had a lot of time to reflect and pray to God, experience his beauty in creation, and the responsibility of tending such a large flock of sheep. And that prepared him well for kingship. So we've covered that off. We all know the story of David defeating Goliath. We don't have time to go into it, but a great show of faith there. Once again, his heart was in the right place. He loved God. He had faith that God would protect him, no matter how big the adversary was. He went up against bears, lions. The giant was no different. He actually had a relationship with Saul, so word got out that David was a very good harp player. No doubt the time he had on his hands as a shepherd. And he actually played the harp which soothed Saul's heart or soul. And so God's setting the scene up. And so there's an existing relationship already between David, who's the anointed king, and the king that's been abandoned, that is Saul. David had to experience a lot of hardship. Who knows how many years it was between when David was anointed to be king and when he was actually made king of Judah, let alone all the entire Judah and Israel, just Judah. Yes, Lucas? 21 years. Close. It was actually 15 years between the time he was anointed. So that's a long period. And as Lucas said before, during that period, he experienced some real hardship. 15 years. Have we ever waited for something in 15 years in our life? It's an extremely long time. But once again, David's heart was in the right place. He became a warrior king. So when he came back from battle, God obviously blessed him, made him victorious in all his battles against the Philistines and other evil nations. The women would sing praises. David or Saul kills his thousands, David his 10,000s. And this created a lot of animosity for Saul, and he got very jealous of David, thinking he could see that God was with David and that he was a threat to his kingdom. And so Saul went out, as Lucas said before, and went to actively kill and destroy David quite a few times in his life. The story of David is really interesting, and this once again, what proves to me that this is God's holy word. This was written by an Israelite. When people write history, the old saying that history is written by the victors, that's very true because basically it's only the victorious and people only record the good stuff in history when we go back through history books. The Bible is different. Because the Bible is inspired by God, it records all the failures, all the weakness, all the sins that the faithful of old, and yes, David was faithful, he was made some very clear promises that he will be raised to see in the future, but he also did fail. He committed murder and he committed adultery in his life. Now, once he recognised that and asked God for forgiveness, God did forgive him for that, but there were consequences. God said that the sword would not depart from his house, and so we know the story of David where a lot of his children had a lot of issues, especially Absalom caused him a lot of heartache in his life, and that was as a result of that sin. But he was forgiven by God. And we can learn a lot by David in regards to the humbleness of David. And yes, he was weak, but he asked God to forgive him. So we are quickly burning through our time here this afternoon. So this is obviously a modern picture of Jerusalem today with the Dome of the Rock. Looks very different today than what it did back then. So this is an artist's interpretation of what Jerusalem may have looked like. So you see at the very top, the tabernacle, when it was moved to Shiloh to Jerusalem, sat at the top there. Then you had David's palace, and then you had a citadel down further that you can see mid-range there. And so from that artist's interpretation, you've got valleys either side. I think this may be from the Mount of Olives potentially in regards to perspective. So like I said, there was a very special promise or covenant that God made to David. And we call this the third big promise in the Old Testament. The first is Genesis 3:15, talking about a saviour, the seed, promised seed, the seed of the woman being Jesus Christ, and the amazing hope that's contained in there. Because before that, we were separate from God and we had no way of getting back and being reconciled with God. And Genesis 3:15 offered that way of salvation where sin would be conquered at some point in the future. So that was the start of the gospel, the good news about Jesus Christ. But then we had the promises made to Abraham in Genesis 12, 13 and 15. And that really expanded on just not the seed, which once again we identified as being Jesus Christ, but land as well, so physical, tangible land. What's beautiful about the third promise made to David is it really ties those two key themes in. A seed that will be promised, that seed would be king, and that earth will be a kingdom of God on earth. So it really beautifully ties those in. I'll quickly read it. So 2 Samuel 7, verses 11 to 16. And as since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and have caused thee to rest from all thine enemies, also the Lord telleth thee that he will make thee an house. And when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I'll set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, and with the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before thee. And thine house and thine kingdom shall be established forever. Before thee thy throne shall be established forever. So I've highlighted some key themes here that we're just going to quickly look at in a bit more detail. So the seed would be provided after David's death. So this promise, parts of it had a dual fulfillment. So we know that his son Solomon did build a house, the temple. David wanted to build it, but God said, no, you're a man of war. I want your son, a man of peace, Solomon, to build the temple. And that gives us some insights as well into how God really identifies himself. He identifies himself as a God of love and of peace. But there was a future prophecy as well. So it was a dual prophecy. Some of it was fulfilled in Solomon. The majority will be fulfilled in the future, both in Jesus Christ and the future kingdom on earth. So seed to set up a house of prayer. And this speaks to a twofold work of Jesus Christ. So Jesus setting up two houses. One is 1 Peter 2 verse 5. It says, lively stones, and that's the house of God. That's the ecclesias that he set up, or the churches. That's one house. The other type of house is the future Temple Mount in the future kingdom, found in Isaiah 56 verse 7 and Isaiah 2 verse 2 to 4. So two houses of God, houses of prayer. God would establish seed as king over David's throne. Absolutely. God would be the seed's father, so it makes that relationship really clear, and we know that Jesus was, in fact, God's son. God would not reject him as he did Saul, so making that delineation that God would not abandon him. Kingdom to be established forever, and that's where we start to split away from, yes, Solomon did build a temple, and that kingdom was established, but it wasn't forever. Judah and that temple was destroyed when the Babylonians sacked, which will be next week, subject for next week. And David would be alive when this promise was fulfilled, and we'll pick at that very shortly. So the seed is identified. So in Luke 31 and 32 and 33, identifies the seed as being Jesus, and it calls David his father. Why does it call David his father? Well, a couple of verses earlier, in verse 27, in Luke chapter 1, it is pointed out to us that a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. So we see Mary was a descendant of David, and therefore Jesus too. So Mary and Joseph were both of the line of Judah and were descendants of David. So that's why, that's why it's identified there in Luke 1. But it's not just Luke. Acts 2, also Acts 13 and chapter 2 also speaks to this seed being identified. And I'll just read verse 22. And when he had removed him, he raised up unto them David to be their king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, I found David, the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, which shall fulfill all my will. Of this man's seed hath God, according to his promise, raised unto Israel a Saviour, Jesus. We're left in zero doubt around who this seed is. And Acts 2, 29-30, men and brethren, let me freely speak unto you of the patriarch David, that he is both dead and buried, and his sepulchre is with us unto this day. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had shown with an oath to him that of the fruit of his loins, according to the flesh, he would raise up Christ to sit on his throne. Zero doubt. Absolutely zero doubt. So David is dead and buried. So I want to just highlight that really quickly. So a lot of modern churches will say that when you die, your reward is heaven. This may be challenging for people that have that view, but this is not actually Bible teaching. It's a man-made concept of when you die, you go to heaven. The Bible is full of examples where the promises made to Abraham were physical land, north, south, east, west. He didn't say up. He didn't say your future promise or your reward is in heaven. It was physical land. And that's why that green line on our timeline is so critical and why we keep linking back to it. It's just so powerful theme that the reward is here on earth in a future kingdom on earth. And if anyone was going to get into heaven, it'd be David, a man after God's own heart. But the Bible clearly tells us that they obtained a good report, they were faithful, but they did not receive the promise in Hebrews 11, verse 39. And furthermore, in Luke chapter 2, verse 34, for David, I think that should be Acts actually, for David is not ascended into the heavens, but he himself, the Lord, saith unto my Lord, sit thou on my right hand. It clearly says that David in the New Testament is not in the heavens, in black and white. So that may be challenging for a number of people, but this is what the Bible teaches, the tangible physical earth promised in the future kingdom. So David must be raised from the dead. And we know in the New Testament it talks about Christ being the first fruits. So he was the first to rise from the dead and to live in everlasting life. And so David will follow as all those that die and be raised in the future. So just filling in our timeline a bit here, we've identified King Saul just before the transition of the millennium. Then we've got King David, and we identified the third promise. Two main elements of that third promise, really bringing the previous two major promises in Genesis 3:15 and Genesis 12:13 and 15 really nicely together and identifying that there be an eternal kingdom on earth based at Jerusalem, and that who will be the king? It will be Jesus Christ, as Luke and Acts clearly identified in the New Testament. So that was a lot of information, beautiful promises made that we can really look forward to, and that's why it's the good news. The gospel is called the good news about Jesus Christ and the coming kingdom of God, because it's so energizing. It's something that we look forward to and we pray will come shortly. So we'll just break for 5 or 10 minutes. The second section is a little bit shorter, so we should still be on time. Was there any questions anyone had or anything to add to that before we break? No? Cool. All right, so if everyone can be back. You don't need 10 minutes, do we? We can do 5. Do 5. 10 past 2, please be back. Thank you. We'll just keep going. Keep to our timeline. So welcome back, everybody. So to the second half of week 4. I did neglect to mention that a lot of this material is in your booklets. So we're currently up to page 28, the next section being Solomon. So in 1 Chronicles chapter 25, verse 5, it says, of all my sons, and the Lord has given me many, so this is David speaking, he has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. So once again, this is an example of, it's amazing how God uses different people from all different backgrounds that end up being the line of Jesus. And so Solomon's mother was Bathsheba. Bathsheba was the woman that David committed adultery with many years ago. And so there's examples in the Bible of prostitutes and different imperfect people that God uses to bring about his will and is actually the line of Jesus. And so this once again speaks to that this isn't the inspired word of God, because if a person was trying to write this, they wouldn't include details like that. It would be a pure line, wouldn't it? And so once again, we can have confidence that this is written by God because it includes all the details. And so, yes, Solomon was selected to be the next king over Israel. Who can tell me an aspect of Solomon, of his reign, of his character? Yes, Lucas.
He was a man of peace. I don't think he ever went to that.
Yes, he was a man of peace. And so David really was a man of war. And so David actually wanted to build God a temple. And God said, no, you're a man of war, like I said earlier. And so he was a man of peace. Yep, that's right. Anything else? Wisdom. He was very wise. So God, at the start of his reign, asked Solomon, you are my servant David's son. What can I give you to help you reign my people well? And Solomon was so overwhelmed of the task of reigning over the children of Israel, he said, I need wisdom to govern these people. And God not only gave him wisdom, but everything else he didn't ask for. Extremely wise. Absolutely. Any other major events of Solomon? Correct. So, yes, he was a time of peace and he was faithful. But as he got older, he did the things that God told him not to do in regards to putting his faith in large amounts of horses and chariots and having too many wives. So back then it was common to have multiple wives and concubines for many different reasons. But God said, keep that to a minimum. But Solomon didn't do that. And so, yeah, it sort of led to him falling away to the back end of his life. So yeah, I like this picture of Solomon. It kind of looks like a guy that's wise, but he's pretty at peace. He's pretty easygoing too. It's not a real picture of Solomon, just a disclaimer. So yes, God gave him wisdom. We know that from 2 Chronicles 1 verse 10 to 12 is that exchange. Reign lasted for 40 years, so relatively long reign for back in those days, given that often they didn't start their reign till later in their life. So from 1970 to 1931 BC. Sorry, 970. Peace and prosperity, as you pointed out, Lucas. Built the temple for God. It was all made off-site and just assembled on-site to reduce the noise in regards to just a reverence about what they were doing. Extremely wise and wealthy. So silver was so common, it was really nothing in the reign of Solomon, and that's what a lot of those movies are based on, because the amount of gold and silver that was sort of accumulated during Solomon's reign is really not accounted for. And wrote Proverbs, Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. So given his wisdom, he reflected on a lot of aspects of life. He really could do anything with his wealth and power, and he tried basically everything from what we understand. And at the end of it, his conclusion was, fear God and keep his commandments, for that's the whole duty of man. And really, everything is vanity but serving God. So some really, really beautiful insights there from the wisest man. He did have lots of wives, 700, I can't even fathom that, and 300 concubines. And the wives did leave him astray. The wives were not all Israelites. They were from Egypt and had different beliefs and sort of led him astray to the back end of his life, which was no good. And so as a result, God said that he's going to break up the kingdom, not in his timeline, because out of respect for David, but that would happen in later generations. So this is Solomon's Jerusalem, so we get an idea of David's Jerusalem versus Solomon, so a time of expansion, a time of prosperity for those 40 years, and the temple was built, as you can see there on the top of the mountain. So this is just another artist's interpretation of what it might have looked like, and Hezekiah's tunnel, which we'll touch on shortly, was redirecting a watercourse underneath the city down to the bottom there during a time of siege. So Solomon's temple, this is once again an artist's interpretation what it looked like. You'll notice it looks very similar to the tabernacle, so I won't go into detail this afternoon about what every element of the temple was. Very similar to the tabernacle, it had its holy place, it had its most holy place that the high priest could only go into once a year. In the holy place we had the showbread, the incense and so forth. On the outside we had the altar where sacrifices were burnt, lots of different aspects there. So it was absolutely beautifully crafted. It was really, would have been an absolute wonder of the ancient world back in the day. So Jerusalem, So I mentioned earlier that Jerusalem's a very special place in God's eyes. It was prophesied in Deuteronomy 12 verse 5, and it says, "But you shall seek the place where the Lord your God chooses out of all your tribes to put his name for his dwelling place, and there you shall go." And that place ended up being Jerusalem. And David took it when he became king and occupied it. It was chosen by God, certainly. So 1 Kings 11 verse 32, Jerusalem the city which I have chosen. And Psalms 132 verse 13 to 14, "For the Lord hath chosen Zion, he hath desired it for his habitation. This is my rest forever, here will I dwell, for I have desired it." So God was very intentional around that being a very special place. And it's actually prophesied to be the future centre capital of the kingdom on earth. And we know that by a lot of the major prophets. We'll just look really quickly at Isaiah and Jeremiah. So Isaiah 2 verse 3 says, "Many people shall come and say, 'Come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house, the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." So this is the context of this verse in Isaiah chapter 2 is talking about that future kingdom age, and that future temple will be situated in Jerusalem. And week 8 of the seminar series will go into great detail around some of these aspects of that future kingdom. Jerusalem will be the centre of the entire earthwide kingdom, and out of it will come laws, will come judgment and justice, and a righteous reign of the King Jesus. And Jeremiah 3 verse 17, "At that time Jerusalem shall be called the throne of the Lord, and all the nations shall be gathered to it, to the name of the Lord to Jerusalem. No more shall they follow the dictates of their evil hearts." So it's no wonder that you turn on the TV today and Jerusalem is still at the centre of contention. Because as we know, the Arab nations have their heritage back to Abraham as well. So they think the promises made to Abraham, they're entitled to them, which is the land of Canaan, which is the modern day Israel. And so both these religious groups trace their heritage back to Abraham and believe it's theirs. And so they will fight to the death. And we see that in the news today, still today, fighting over the same bit of land. But God has promised that it is the future capital of that future kingdom, and that the Jews are actually God's people and his witnesses on earth until Jesus returns. So we come to this, I'm not going to read that out, but it's in bold as the key piece in regards to the kingdom divided. So like I said, Solomon fell away at the end. He started to do a bit of idol worship. He set up high places incorrectly in breach of the law of Moses. So I'll just read this out. So setting the scene for the division of the 12 tribes of Israel. Solomon was at the end of his reign. There was a man named Jeroboam who was not of the line of David, but was a skilled worker. And when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he placed Jeroboam over the labour force of the tribes of Joseph in 1 Kings 11 verse 28. One day the prophet Ahijah approached Jeroboam with a prophecy. The prophet tore a new cloak into 12 pieces and said, "Take the 10 pieces, for thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and will give 10 tribes to thee." 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 31. The idol worship of the Israelites caused God to divide the kingdom. The house of David would retain a remnant of the kingdom, including Jerusalem, because of God's covenant with David. So God was in this. It didn't happen because events unfolded without God's intervention. God was intentionally doing this as a direct result of the lack of leadership from Solomon and the falling away of following the law. But he kept a remnant to keep his promise to David, which was the two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, with Jerusalem still at the centre capital. So Solomon had a son, Rehoboam, so he should have been the rightful king over all 12 tribes. And the people did go to Rehoboam once Solomon was off the scene and said, "We want to follow you, but we really need the taxes lowered." And Rehoboam followed not very good advice and went to increase the taxes, and the people abandoned Rehoboam and they flocked to Jeroboam. And that's how that change or that split naturally happened on the ground floor. But we know God was over it because the prophet Ahijah had come and told Jeroboam that he would be the king of Israel over the 10 northern tribes. This was problematic though, because a lot of the northern tribes it was still the law that they would come down to Jerusalem once a year to sacrifice. And so Jeroboam, he wasn't happy about this. I'm going to lose people to the southern tribe. So what did he do? He set up 2 calves for worship, one in Dan and the other in Bethel, so north and south. So the people didn't have to travel anywhere in the kingdom. They were pretty close to be able to get there. So Jeroboam was now the king of the 10 tribes of Israel, or the nation of Israel, all wicked kings, not one good king. The tribe of Judah had a mix of good and bad kings. And when we say bad, it means not following God's laws, idolatry, idol worship, that kind of stuff. So this isn't a great start. And there's a classic phrase in the Bible, Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. That phrase is mentioned time and time again. And it's a mark left for Jeroboam in regards to leading Israel away from God. And there's that classic phrase there. So here's the list of all the kings of Israel and all the kings of Judah. The blue ones are the good kings. So we had Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joash, Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Hezekiah, and Josiah. So a lot of those names you may have heard when you're reading the Chronicles or the Kings in the Old Testament. They weren't all perfect, we're not saying that, but they certainly did try. They tried to get rid of the high places. They tried to turn the people back from idolatry, back to God, and back on track. So on that timeline, let's put the kingdom split up there. So the Judah line continued and Israel was split out as a separate nation. And straight away, they're at odds with each other. Straight away, there's skirmishes and even full-scale warfare between the two nations, which is crazy because they're brothers and sisters. That's such as human nature. So prophets of Israel, like I mentioned earlier, prophets were sent by God to really correct either the kings, went directly to the kings, or went to the people themselves to try and get them back to God. And a lot of the back end of the Old Testament has the majority of the major prophets. They were sent to, at times, lawless nations. Sometimes they weren't sent to Israel or Judah. They were actually sent to Gentile nations like Nineveh, and we have the story of Jonah that speaks to that. So God was not just only concerned with Israelites, but he was trying to correct that whole region. Had to prove they were sent from God, so they had to do a short-term prophecy that would come true in the immediate period, so the people would know, oh, that is actually a prophet from God. They had to prove themselves. They were often mistreated. Often the message they had was not well received. People didn't like it. Kings didn't like to be told that they were doing the wrong thing. The faithful prophets delivered warnings to unfaithful and encouragement to the faithful. So the Bible tells us that there was always a remnant of faithful, and that's really encouraging for us. I like to think that those here and those listening online are a remnant of the faithful in our day, where we're trying to follow God. Yes, we still have sin nature, but we have the amazing hope through Jesus Christ that we have on offer today. But there was always a remnant of faithful. So in 2 Kings 17 verse 13 expresses God's mercy. The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers, turn from your evil ways, observe my commandments and decrees. This shows God our Father as extremely patient, extremely loving Father. How many times do we forgive our own children when they've done the wrong thing? And we see that expressed in God's love and mercy here, where he just keeps trying. They keep stepping away from God, and he keeps trying to bring them back into the fold. So prophets sent directly to Israel. We have Elijah. It was a big event, Elijah's work. Anyone know? Big event. It was on top of a mountain. Mount Carmel. Yeah, that was a classic story of challenging the people to pick a side. Either pick Baal or pick God. And it was a test of who was the rightful God. And of course, Yahweh won that contest. And all the Baals of prophet were killed. We then had his apprentice, Elisha, had a double portion of the Spirit from Elijah. We had the story of Jonah, which we briefly talked about. My kids love that story, in the belly of the fish for 3 days. And then he eventually made it to Nineveh and turned those people around. We have Amos, Hosea, Micah. And this is a great graphic showing where all the prophets were. A lot of them were contemporary with each other, and sometimes we lose sight of that in the Bible. Sometimes when we're reading them, in series, we lose sight that they were actually in parallel, and a lot of them were contemporary with each other. So the top line is the kings of Israel, and the bottom line is the kings of Judah. Once again, once again, there was good kings in the kings of Judah, and that made that nation go for a bit longer, which we'll look at really quickly now. So if you go to page 30 of your booklets, we'll quickly look at, and I mean really quickly, look at the Assyrian campaigns against Israel and Judah. So there was 3 major campaigns of the Assyrians. So the campaign of Tiglath, which was 745 to 727 BC, and then eventually the campaign of Shalmaneser from BC 720, which was successful and eventually conquered the then known nation of Israel. So the Assyrians used massive armies, so it was a shock and awe campaign. They used the world's first war engines, so siege machines. So they invented iron, and they were starting to get pretty clever with the machines of war they used. Ruthless terror, impaled victims, skinned alive, really horrible people. And this were the people that occupied the land, well, similar people that occupied the land that, really evil, that God wanted to get rid of. But God used them in a way to bring about judgment to the nation of Israel, because time and time again, they rejected the prophets, they rejected God's call to come back to the fold. And they sent shockwaves through invading countries. And so the Israelite kingdom, so all 10 tribes were taken captive in 722 BC. And so, cool. And they lasted on total for 210 years. So back to our timeline, we see here that the children of Israel were taken captive by the Assyrian army. So, has anyone heard of the 10 lost tribes? People heard of that? There's a lot of conspiracy theories. There's a religious group that believe in the UK that they're the 10 lost tribes. There's some theories that Japan and the North American Indians are part of the 10 lost tribes. Some really, a lot of theories about what happened to them. But what actually really happened, and the Bible gives us some clues, is basically that they just got intermarried with the nations, and they really lost a lot of their identity, but there was still some identity. So when we go and have a look at the New Testament, in the Gospels, the prophetess Anna, in Luke 2 verse 36, was from the tribe of Asher, and one of the 10 supposedly lost tribes. Anna wasn't lost at all. Both Zechariah and Elizabeth, so obviously the father and mother there and of John the Baptist, are from the tribe of Levi, and we know that from Luke 1 verse 5. So they weren't lost at all. They just did intermarry, and they lost a lot of their identity when they were in the land of Syria. So obviously when they're in Assyria, the Babylonians took over, which we'll cover off next week. And so when the tribe of Judah went back to the land of Israel after 70 years captivity, which we'll cover off, they obviously went with them back into the land of back to the land of Israel. But they'd lost a lot of their identity as tribes. So let's briefly look at the kingdom of Judah. It lasted more than 340 years, so 130 years longer than Israel, from 930 to 586 BC. Once again, it was a mixture of prosperity and adversity. Adversity brought upon them by sin. Once again, sin, suffering, seeking and salvation also happened in this period. Words spoken to King Asa rang true. In 2 Chronicles 15 verse 2, and he went out to meet Asa and said to him, "Hear me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you while you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you." And that was really the key promise that they made back at Mount Sinai. They committed to God that they would follow him. And God's response was, "You will be blessed. I will look after you. You won't experience the hardship and the sickness that other nations experience." But once again, they just kept on going back to sin and abandoning God. So the Assyrians had a crack at Judah, wasn't successful. They were defeated. So King Hezekiah was king of Judah at this time. So once again, the 10 tribes are in captivity. Syrians got, yes, we're working down because they've come from up near modern day Iran. They've come down, got the northern 10 tribes, moving down to Judah. We know, some of us may know the story where the Syrians invaded and sieged the city, and they were going to win. They were starving the people out. They had this huge army, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, until Hezekiah obviously prayed to God, and God intervened. And God, or the angels, God's angels, killed 185,000 of the soldiers. Now, there's actually an archaeological record of this. It doesn't mention that they were absolutely slaughtered, but it talks about attacking Jerusalem, but then going back to their home nation. It doesn't talk about the loss. So once again, that's a human history record, doesn't record the bad stuff. So what prophets went to Judah? Some of these you may recognise as major books in the Old Testament: Micah, Isaiah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, and Habakkuk. So once again, you can see those all at the back end of Judah's reign, coming down to 600 BC. So we're getting really close to Jesus Christ. So that's the end of the content for this week. Next week, we'll go into look at the end of the tribe of Judah, or the nation of Judah, and the captivity in Babylon. It was 70 years prophesied, and then they returned to Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple that was destroyed when the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem, and we'll look at that period of time where they were trying to come back to God, and also the 400 years of silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's a lot that's obviously not written in the Bible that we know from history, and so the speaker will take us through those events leading up to and setting the scene for Jesus' birth during the Roman occupation in 0 AD. We're right on time. Thanks everyone. Was there any questions or anything to add to that I may have missed? Any main point or theme or linkage, golden thread that someone wanted to call out as we conclude this afternoon? No, once again, I'd like to thank you so much for your participation. It's really great to spend this time together and learn more about God's Word. We will close in prayer.